They gave the plain sister to the feared duke to be rid of her, and thought themselves very clever, and never once suspected that they had just handed away the only treasure their house possessed. It happened this way. The Duke of Ravensmere, the Iron Duke, the feared one, the man of whom the whole county spoke in lowered voices, had need of a wife, and had let it be known, through the usual channels, that he would take a bride from among the daughters of the neighboring gentry, and would settle handsomely on her family in the bargain. And this had thrown the household of Sir Marcus Thorne into a fever of calculation, because Sir Marcus had 2 daughters, and the Duke's offer was a fortune, and the Duke was also, by every account, a cold and terrible man, and the question that consumed the Thornes was, which daughter to sacrifice? For the Thornes did not think of it as anything but a sacrifice. The Duke of Ravensmere was feared, grim, scarred by some old sorrow, shut up in his great forbidding house, spoken of as heartless and cruel, and to marry a daughter to him was, in the Thornes' minds, to feed her to an ogre. But the fortune he offered was too great to refuse. And so the Thornes made the calculation that such families make. They would not sacrifice Celine, the elder, the beauty, the favored daughter for whom they had grand ambitions, and a brilliant match in view. They would sacrifice Anne, the younger, the plain one, the quiet one, the overlooked one, the daughter who had never been the family's pride, who was thought too plain to make any brilliant match of her own, and who was therefore expendable, the one whose loss to the ogre would cost the family least, and whose absence, if the Duke proved as cruel as rumored, they would feel least keenly. They did not put it to Anne so baldly, of course. They dressed it up. An honor, a great match, the Duke's particular preference, a lie, her duty to the family. But Anne Thorne was not a fool, however plain, and she understood exactly what was being done, that she was being given to the feared Duke because she was the daughter the family could most easily spare, that her pretty sister was being protected from the ogre at the plain sister's expense, that she was, in the family's cold arithmetic, the acceptable loss. She understood it, and it hurt. Of course it hurt, to be handed to a man everyone called a monster, precisely because one's own family valued one least. But Anne had spent her whole life being the overlooked sister, and she had learned, in that long apprenticeship, a certain hard dignity, and she did not weep or protest. She simply lifted her chin and agreed to marry the Duke of Ravensmere, because there was no use in refusing, and because some small defiant part of her thought, very well, if I am the one they can spare, then let me go, and let me meet this ogre with more courage than any of them would have shown, and let me not give them the satisfaction of seeing me afraid. So Anne Thorne was married to the feared Duke of Ravensmere, a cold, quick ceremony, her family visibly relieved to have discharged the fortune-winning sacrifice at the cheapest price, her pretty sister Celine embracing her with a pity that did not quite hide her relief at having been spared. And Anne went to her new husband's great forbidding house, braced, as the whole county was braced on her behalf, to meet a monster and endure a cruel marriage as best she could. The journey to Ravensmere was the loneliest of Anne's life, and she spent it not in weeping, but in a fierce, quiet marshalling of her own courage. For she had no illusions about what she was traveling toward. She had been handed to a monster to be rid of her. Her family had wept the crocodile tears of people relieved to have discharged an unpleasant duty at a bargain price. Her pretty sister had embraced her with a pity that did not hide her relief. Anne had watched all of it with the clear eye of a woman long practiced in seeing her own worth in others' faces, and she had understood that she was, to every person she was leaving behind, a problem solved. The plain daughter got off the family's hands and turned to profit besides. It would have broken a softer woman. But Anne had been the overlooked sister for 20 years, and the long apprenticeship had forged in her something her family had never suspected and never valued. A hard, bright core of dignity, the particular strength of a person who has been undervalued so long that she has been forced to become her own source of worth, since no one else would supply it. And she drew on that core, in the lonely carriage, and made herself a promise that whatever the ogre proved to be, whatever cruelty awaited her at Ravensmere, she would meet it with her head high, and would not let either the monster or the family that had fed her to him see her broken, because her dignity was the one thing that was hers, that no one had given her, and no one could take. and she would keep it whatever it cost. She arrived at the great forbidding house, braced for cruelty. The vast dark pile, the silent, fearful servants, the whole grim apparatus of the ogre's lair, exactly as the county's whispers had painted it. And she was shown to the feared Duke, and she lifted her chin, and prepared to meet a monster with more courage than any of the people who had sent her here would have shown. And the monster, when she met him, was a tired, grim, lonely-eyed man who looked at her with as much wariness as she felt. Braced, she realized with a jolt, exactly as she was braced, for cruelty from her. Expecting, she understood, a bride who would flinch and fear and loathe him, because that was what he had learned to expect from everyone. And something in Anne's clear-seeing eye caught it at once. That the ogre was afraid of her nearly as much as she was of him. That the feared Duke feared, in his turn, the flinching and the loathing he had met his whole life. That they were two people each braced against the other's expected cruelty, each armored, each alone. And it was that recognition, that the monster was as braced and as lonely as she, which had prompted Anne, on their first evening across the cold table, to set down her armor and speak the truth instead, to name them both as the overlooked and the thrown away, to refuse to fear him. She had gone to Ravensmere prepared to endure an ogre with dignity. She had found, instead, a fellow prisoner of the world's cold judgments, and had extended to him, because she knew from the inside exactly how badly it was needed, the one thing neither of them had ever been given, the assumption of humanity, the refusal to see a monster, the clear look that found, under the fearsome reputation, only a lonely man. It had cost her a moment's courage, the setting down of her armor, and it had won her, in return, the first person in her life who set down his armor for her. And that mutual disarming, two braced and lonely people each choosing, against all their scars, to trust the other, was the true beginning of everything that followed, and the reason the sacrifice the whole county pitied became the happiest marriage in 3 shires. She was not braced for what she actually found. For the Duke of Ravensmere was not an ogre. That was the discovery that undid every expectation, hers and the county's both. He was grim, yes, and quiet, and marked by some deep old sorrow that had frozen him hard. But underneath the fearsome reputation was not cruelty, but grief. And under the grief, when Anne troubled to look, was a man as lonely and as overlooked in his way as she was in hers. For the Duke of Ravensmere had been feared his whole life, shunned, whispered about, treated as a monster by a county that had decided, on the strength of his grim looks and his old griefs and his solitary ways, that he was heartless, and he had grown so accustomed to being feared that he had stopped expecting anything else, had wrapped himself in the reputation because it was easier than the loneliness underneath, and had resigned himself to a life in which no one would ever look past the ogre to the man. And then the Thorns had sent him their plain overlooked sister, sent her, he understood at once, because she was the one they could spare, thrown to the ogre to protect the pretty one, and the Duke of Ravensmere had braced, in his turn, for a bride who would fear him, and flinch from him, and endure him as a sacrifice, as everyone always had. And Anne Thorne had looked at him, really looked, on their first evening, across the great cold dining table, and had not flinched, and had not feared, and had said, in her quiet, dry voice, "They gave me to you, because I am the one they could spare, your grace, the plain sister. I imagine you know it. You seem a man who knows things. And I imagine they told you, or let you believe, that you were getting the lesser daughter, the overlooked one, the one nobody wanted. So we begin, you and I, each having been handed to the other as a kind of second best. You the ogre no one would choose. I the plain sister no one would keep. It is not a flattering foundation for a marriage, but I find I would rather begin with the truth of it than with pretenses. And the truth is that we are 2 overlooked people who have been pushed together because no one else wanted either of us. And that is a sad thing, but it is also perhaps a fair one, because at least we begin as equals, each as unwanted as the other, and perhaps 2 people that the world has thrown away can make something between them that the wanted and the valued never trouble to make at all. I do not fear you, your grace. I have been the unwanted one too long to fear a fellow unwanted person. Shall we see what 2 thrown away people can build? It is more than either of us was likely to get elsewhere. And the Duke of Ravensmere, who had braced for a flinching sacrifice, and been met instead with this clear, dry, unfrightened honesty, this recognition, this naming of them both as fellow overlooked souls, this refusal to fear him, felt something crack in the frozen grief of years, because no one, in the whole of his feared and lonely life, had ever looked at him and seen not an ogre, but a fellow unwanted person, and he understood, on that first evening, that the Thorns had not given him their lesser daughter at all. They had given him, in their blind, cold arithmetic, the one person in the world who could see him, and had thrown her away thinking her worthless, exactly as the world had thrown him away, and that the two of them, the ogre and the plain sister, the county's monster and the family's afterthought, might just be the salvation of each other. They built it, the two thrown-away people, and it was the making of them both. It began with honesty, because Anne had begun with honesty, and the Duke of Ravensmere, starved his whole life of anyone who would speak to him truly rather than fearfully, met her honesty with his own, and the two of them, over the first weeks of their strange marriage, did the thing that neither had ever been permitted to do with another soul. They simply told each other the truth, and were themselves, and were not afraid. Anne told the Duke what it had been to be the plain, overlooked sister, valued at nothing, spared nothing, handed to an ogre because she was the acceptable loss. And the Duke told Anne what it had been to be the feared one, shunned and whispered about, wrapped in a monstrous reputation that was easier to wear than the loneliness beneath it. And each of them, hearing the other, recognized a fellow sufferer. Two people the world had decided to discard, one for being plain and overlooked, one for being grim and feared. And in the recognition, the discarding of both was undone, because it is very difficult to feel worthless in the eyes of a person who has looked at you clearly and found you precious. For the Duke found Anne precious. That was the thing that astonished the county, and at first, Anne herself. He, who had been feared, was not frightening to her. She, who had been overlooked, was not overlooked by him. He saw her quiet, dry wit, her hard-won dignity, her clear, unfrightened honesty, the whole quality of her that her family had never troubled to notice because they were too busy admiring her pretty sister. And, seeing her, he came to adore her, with the particular devotion of a man who has been given, unexpectedly, the one thing he had stopped hoping for, someone who looked past the monster to the man, and stayed. And Anne, adored for the first time in her life, valued for the first time in her life, bloomed, the plainness the world had seen resolving, under the warmth of being cherished, into something the world had simply never bothered to look at properly, because a woman who is valued carries herself differently than a woman who is spared. And Anne Thorne, who had been the overlooked sister, became, as the Duchess of Ravensmere, a woman transformed by the simple revolutionary experience of being wanted. There was one evening early in the marriage that Anne kept, ever after, as the moment she understood she had not been sacrificed but saved. They had fallen into a habit, the Duke and she, of sitting together after dinner in the small, warm library, rather than retiring to separate wings as grand cold couples did, because neither of them, having been so long alone, could quite bear to waste the novelty of company that did not fear or overlook them. And on this evening the Duke had been quiet a long while, and then had said abruptly, the thing that undid her, "I have been trying to understand why my house feels different since you came to it. It is the same house, the same cold rooms I have rattled around alone for years. And yet it does not feel cold now, and I could not think why, until this evening, when I understood. It is that I look forward, now, to coming into a room. My whole life I have come into rooms and watched people go quiet and wary, watched them fear me, watched them wish me elsewhere. And so I learned to dread rooms, to dread the moment of entering and seeing the faces close. And now I come into a room and you are in it, and you do not go quiet or wary. You look up and you are glad, actually glad to see me. And I had forgotten, Anne. I had entirely forgotten what it was to have someone be glad when I entered a room. It has not happened to me since I was a boy. I did not know how starved of it I was until you gave it back to me, simply by looking up gladly when I come in. That is what has changed in the house. Someone is glad when I enter. It is a small thing. It is everything. And Anne Thorne, hearing this, felt her own long starvation answered in the same breath, because it was her exact hunger too, mirrored. I know, she said, because it is the same for me, only the other way. My whole life, no one was ever particularly glad when I entered a room either, not from fear, in my case, but from indifference. I was the plain sister, the overlooked one, and rooms did not go wary when I came in. They simply did not notice, which is its own kind of coldness. To be feared and to be overlooked are different roads, Julian, but they arrive at the same lonely place, a person no one is glad to see. And now I come into a room and you look up, and you are glad. Glad of me, plain overlooked Anne, whom no one has ever been particularly glad of. And it undoes me exactly as it undoes you, because I too had forgotten, or perhaps never known, what it is to be someone another person is glad to see. We have given each other the same thing, you and I. Gladness. The gladness of being entered upon by someone who wanted us there. It is, as you say, a small thing and everything. I think it may be the whole of what love actually is, under all the rest, to be the person someone is glad to see come into a room. My family were never glad to see me. Your county was never glad to see you. And now here we are. Two people the world was never glad of each other, and I find I would not trade it for all the being admired in England, because admiration is not gladness, and I have had a lifetime of neither, and now I have gladness, and it is better than I ever imagined anything could be. And the Duke of Ravensmere crossed the small, warm library and took his wife's hands. The plain sister no one had been glad of, the ogre no one had been glad of, glad now of each other, and Anne understood, fully, that the cold calculation that had handed her to a feared stranger had not been a sacrifice at all, but a rescue in disguise. That her family, meaning to be rid of her, had delivered her out of a house where no one was glad of her, into the arms of the one man in England who would be glad of her every day for the rest of her life, and that she owed the whole of her happiness, absurdly, to having been the daughter they valued least. The county watched, and could not understand it. It had sent the plain Thorne girl to the ogre as a sacrifice, and had waited to hear of her misery, and instead, the reports that trickled out of Ravensmere were all wrong, were of a duke transformed, thawed, seen for the first time in years to smile, and of a duchess who was not miserable at all, but radiant, and of a marriage that was, against every expectation, plainly and deeply happy. The feared duke was not an ogre after all, it seemed, and the plain sister was not so plain after all, it seemed, and the county, which had pitied Anne Thorne, found itself within a season obliged to envy her instead, which is a very different and much more grudging emotion. And the Thornes, the family who had thrown Anne away, felt the reversal most keenly of all, and it worked in them exactly as such reversals work in the small and calculating. For Sir Marcus and Lady Thorne, and the beautiful Celine, had given Anne to the Duke believing they were sacrificing their least valuable daughter for a fortune, spending the expendable one, protecting the treasure, and now the expendable one was a duchess, radiantly happy, adored by a duke who had turned out to be one of the greatest matches in England, rather than a monster, while Celine, the treasure, the favored one for whom the brilliant match had been reserved, was still unmarried, her grand prospects somehow not materializing, watching her plain, overlooked sister occupy the exact glittering position the family had always assumed would be Celine's. The arithmetic had inverted entirely. The Thornes had bet on the wrong daughter, had thrown away the winning card thinking it the losing one, and they could not bear it. And they did what such families do. Having discarded Anne, they now, seeing her risen, tried to reclaim her. They descended on Ravensmere. They wrote affectionate letters. They visited. They spoke now of our dear Anne and our beloved daughter, and how they had always known she was destined for greatness, how the match had been their own doing, how proud they were, how close the family had always been. Lady Thorne, who had never troubled to notice Anne in 20 years, now could not say her name without a caress. And Celine, beautiful, unmarried, watching her plain sister's triumph with a jealousy she could not quite hide, attached herself to Anne with a sudden effusive sisterly devotion, angling, It was soon clear, for two things: the reflected glory of a ducal sister, and the chance that the Duke of Ravensmere might introduce her to his grand connections and secure her, at last, the brilliant match that had eluded her. Anne watched the whole shameless reversal with the clear, dry eye she turned on everything, and was neither deceived nor quite embittered, for she had made her peace, long ago, with what her family was, and their sudden warmth did not fool her for an instant. But it presented a question, and it was the Duke in the end who forced it, because the Duke of Ravensmere had watched his wife's family throw her away as worthless, and now watched them come fawning back the moment she rose, and it roused in him a cold, protective fury on her behalf that he did not trouble to hide. "They threw you away," the Duke said to Anne, one evening, after a visit in which Lady Thorne had been particularly cloying and Céline particularly angling. "They handed you to me as their acceptable loss, to be rid of you, and to protect the sister they actually valued. And now that you are risen, they come fawning, our dear Anne, as though they had cherished you all along, and your sister attaches herself to you, angling for introductions to my connections, wanting to use your position to secure the brilliant match she still expects as her due. I have watched it for weeks, and I find I can barely be civil to them, because I remember, I will always remember, that these are the people who looked at you, the finest person I have ever known, and saw an afterthought, an expendable daughter, a loss they could afford, and now they want to bask in what they threw away. It galls me past bearing. Say the word, Anne, and I will make it very clear to your family exactly how unwelcome their sudden devotion is, and send them home, and never receive them again. You owe them nothing. They gave you to an ogre to be rid of you. Let me be the ogre they feared, on your behalf, and rid you of them." And Anne Thorne, Duchess of Ravensmere now, considered it, seriously, because it was tempting, and because her husband's protective fury on her behalf was itself a kind of balm after 20 years of being unprotected. But she was Anne, and she answered him from the hard-won dignity that was the whole of what her overlooked life had given her. "No," she said, "or rather, not that. I understand the temptation. I feel it too. There would be a satisfaction in letting you loose on them, in watching the family who spared me nothing be sent away in disgrace by the ogre they fed me to. But I find I do not want it, and I will tell you why, because it matters. If I use your power to revenge myself on them, to crush them, to shame them, to send them away, then I let them make me, at the last, as small as they always thought me, a woman who, given power, uses it for spite. And I have spent my whole life refusing to be as small as they thought me. When they overlooked me, I kept my dignity. When they threw me away, I went with my head high. I will not now, having risen, throw away the one thing that carried me through all those years, which is that I am better than their smallness. Not grander now, though I am that too, but better, kinder, larger. So I will not have you crush them. I will do the thing that is harder, and that galls them far more. I will be gracious. I will receive them with perfect courtesy, and be kind to them, and let them sit, every visit, in the full knowledge of what they threw away, and how completely they misjudged it, because there is no revenge on people like my family so complete as forcing them to be grateful to the daughter they discarded, to depend on her charity, to know that the afterthought they spared nothing has become the person whose goodwill they now court. Let them come, let them fawn, and let me be so plainly, unassailably good to them that they cannot help but understand, every day, that they threw away a treasure and kept the dross, and that the treasure is generous enough not even to make them pay for it, which is the one thing that will gall them to the end of their days, because smallness cannot bear to be forgiven by the greatness it failed to recognize. And Céline? The Duke asked, who attaches herself to you angling for introductions, wanting to use your position for the brilliant match she still thinks her due. Anne was quiet a moment. Céline, she said, was as much a victim of my family's values as I was, in her way, raised to believe her whole worth was her beauty and her brilliant match, and now watching the beauty fade a little each season, and the brilliant match not come, and her plain overlooked sister leap past her into the very glory Céline was promised. She is jealous and grasping, and she angles shamelessly, and I do not much like her, and she was not kind to me in the years when kindness would have cost her nothing. But I find I pity her more than I resent her, because she was taught that she was only her beauty, and beauty is a cruel thing to be taught you are only, since it fades and leaves you nothing, whereas I was taught I was nothing, and being taught you are nothing, it turns out, leaves you free to become something, because you have nothing to lose, and no false value to protect. So I will help Celine, not to the grand match she covets, which I will not spend my husband's connections to buy her, for she has not earned it, and it would only feed the values that are ruining her, but to something better, if I can. I will try to show her, by simply being what I am, that there is more to a woman than her face and her match, that the sister she pitied for being plain has found a happiness her beauty never won her, and that perhaps there is another way to be than the one our family taught us both. It may not take, she may go on grasping, but I will not crush her either. I have been the discarded sister. I know too well what it is to be made small. I will not do it to her, even in return, even earned. I would rather try to make her larger, as being loved has made me larger. That is my answer, Julian. Grace, not revenge. It is the only revenge worth having, and the only one I can take without becoming what I have spent my life refusing to be. And the Duke of Ravensmere looked at his wife, the plain sister thrown away as worthless, who had risen and now chose, with power in her hands, grace over vengeance and mercy over spite, and understood that the thorns had not merely thrown away a treasure, they had thrown away a soul so far finer than they could comprehend, that they would never, to their dying day, grasp the scale of what they had lost, and that he, the feared ogre no one had wanted, had been given her, and adored her, and would spend his life being grateful for their blindness. I said, that first evening, that we were two thrown-away people who might make something of each other, he said. I did not know then how far from thrown away you truly were, that they had discarded not a lesser thing but a greater one, greater than any of us, greater than me. I feared, when we married, that I was getting the sister no one wanted. I got the finest woman in England, and the only person who ever saw past the ogre to the man, and I have adored you since the first evening you told me the truth across that cold table and did not flinch. I love you, Anne. They threw you away. It was the luckiest thing that ever happened to me. The day your family's coldness handed me the treasure they were too blind to keep. I shall bless their blindness to the end of my life, even as I never quite forgive it, because it gave me you. And Anne Thorne, Duchess of Ravensmere, who had been given to the feared Duke to be rid of her, looked at the man who adored her and understood that she had, by the strange arithmetic of the discarded, come out of her family's cold calculation with the one thing none of them had, a marriage of true and equal love between two people the world had thrown away, who had found in each other the seeing and the cherishing that the valued and the wanted so often never find at all. The marriage of the feared Duke and the plain sister became, in time, one of the wonders of the county, the more so because it confounded every expectation the county had brought to it. The ogre turned out to be no ogre. The plain sister turned out to be no fool, and, once cherished, no plain thing either. And the sacrifice everyone had pitied turned out to be the happiest marriage in 3 shires, between two people whose long apprenticeships in being overlooked had taught them, better than any pampered pair could ever have learned, exactly how precious it is to be truly seen. The thorns came and fawned, and were received with the unassailable grace Anne had promised, and it galled them, exactly as she had foretold, to be forgiven and befriended by the daughter they had discarded, to depend on the charity of the afterthought, to sit at the table of the plain sister's triumph and know, every moment, how catastrophically they had misjudged. And Celine, grasping, jealous Celine, was helped, in the end, not to a grand match, but to something Anne thought better, for under the steady influence of a sister, who was so plainly happy for reasons that had nothing to do with beauty or brilliant matches, Celine began, slowly, grudgingly, to question the values that were making her miserable, and married at last not the brilliant match she had chased, but a good, kind, ordinary man who valued her for more than her fading face, and was, Anne was glad to see, the better and the happier for it. The Plain Sisters' grace had, in the end, done what her family's cruelty never could, made them all a little larger. "They gave you to me to be rid of you," the Duke of Ravensmere said to his wife, late in their long life, watching their children, dark like him, dry-witted like her, feared by no one, and overlooked by no one, play in the gardens of the great house that had once been so cold. The plain sister, the acceptable loss. And I have thought often of what it means, that the two of us, the ogre and the afterthought, the ones nobody wanted, have been happier than any of the wanted, and the valued, and the treasured. Why is that, do you think? Why should the thrown away make better marriages than the sought after? Because we knew how to see, Anne said. That is the whole of it, I think. The wanted and the valued are never really looked at. They are admired, envied, pursued, but not seen, because everyone is too busy wanting them to look at them. And the thrown away, the plain, the feared, the overlooked. We learn to look, because no one looks at us, and so we know how precious it is. And when at last we find another overlooked soul, we look at them the way we always longed to be looked at. And it is the looking that makes the love. My family gave me to you as a sacrifice, and thought me worthless, and thought you a monster, and they were blind on every count, because they had never learned to look, having never needed to. We had learned. It was the one gift our long unwanted years gave us, the ability to see, truly, which the wanted never acquire. And so two thrown-away people who could see, found each other, and saw each other, and were happier than all the treasured people who never learned to look at anyone at all. It is not so strange when you think of it that way. The discarded, it turns out, are the only ones who know how to find the treasure, because we spent our whole lives being the treasure that no one else could see.